expect good texture and vibrancy in your acrylic paintings? If so, I've got 7 tips that are going to help you with that problem. Let's have a closer look. Now in this demonstration, I'm going to show you 7 techniques that I like to use with my acrylic landscape painting. And I'm just using normal, regular student acrylic paint. No pastes, no mediums. That's important because texture comes from how you use the brush. It's all about brushwork, not what you add to your acrylic paints. And you don't have to spend a fortune on special heavy body acrylics either. What you're doing is creating the illusion of texture. Yes, there is some impasto, there is layers of paint, but it's not about building up thickness so much as how you use the brush. I guarantee you that these techniques are going to help your landscape painting. So let's get into the demonstration and learn more about texture with your acrylics. Here's the attractive reference that I'm going to work with, creating something vibrant. And I'm using regular acrylic paints. These are Amsterdam acrylics and a couple of Winslow Newton Galleria acrylics, a basic palette of warm and cool primaries, and a few convenience colors like burnt sienna and yellow ochre. And that's it. You can do anything you want with a palette like this. Long flat brushes for the most part, and a filbert, and then a panel, primed panel, quite simple. First tip is tone the panel. That toning is going to help with texture. Some of it's going to show through, and you've already got a layer of paint down even before you've actually started the main event. And I find the toning can sometimes have a very important influence on the overall harmony of the paints that go over it. I'm going to just use some tissue and remove some paint where the lightest light is, and also suggest the foreground and where the buildings are going to go. But for the rest, I'll now let this dry. Doesn't take too long with acrylics, and then we can start the painting. I've done a bit of loose composing with a rigger brush, just getting the ideas going and getting the flow of thoughts, leaving a few things out, emphasizing a few others. And just figuring out where I'm going to be doing some of the texturing as well, especially in the foreground. Clean all of that off from the palette. A clean palette results in clean color notes, so that's important. I'm going to start with the sky and work down. For the sky, I'm bringing in some white paint at this stage. And the second texture tip I can give you is create a sort of a blending gradation, and that creates a texture as well. Texture doesn't necessarily have to be thick paint. In this case, we're creating a warm just above the ridge line of the hill, and then a bit cooler as we go to the top, and this creates depth, a sense of the sky moving up and away, creating more depth in the scene. A few suggested wisps of clouds to add a little extra texture and interest to the sky. Now the background hill will also be dealt with quite lightly with a bit of desaturated and cooled down yellow ochre. I have raised that hill, as you can tell from the reference, as a backdrop, and also to make sure that the roofs of the houses don't intersect with the ridge of the hill, as in the reference, and that creates a bit of tension. And the other tip I can give you is try to keep the white paint out for as long as possible. Aside from the sky, when I get into the main event, there is little white. Now, dabbing strokes with the brush is the third tip that I can give for texture, and this is quite a common technique. You'll use it a lot, especially painting in an impressionist style. Now, I do mention this because a lot of beginners paint large, flat surfaces. Instead, work with short dabbing strokes, build up your colors that way, and you'll get broken color as well. You're not painting between the lines like in a coloring book with a lot of flat color. So you'll see how I move the brush around, back and forth, up and down, chopping and dabbing color. Even in this first blocking in layer, we're getting texture. In fact, we have 2 layers of paint now, the toning layer and this layer on top. And you can see without white paint in this blocking in layer, the yellows are vibrant, they're working with the red undertone. Variety, that's just another little tip I can give you. Variety of shapes and color temperatures. Further back in this middle distance, the color temperature is actually cooler. There's a little bit of white coming into the paint, and white, especially titanium white, cools paint down quite dramatically, and acrylics more so than even with oils. So you can see all of that texture already, and we haven't even got into thicker paint. Now let's just block in a few of the buildings, shadow and light colors. Shadows are a sort of a grayish violet. And then the lights, just a desaturated yellow, ochre and white. This also helps to make sure that the buildings do recede a little as well. The orange colors are also desaturated slightly with a bit of white paint. The warmest color will be in the foreground, so just keep that in mind. You don't want to put your warmest colors in the background in a painting like this. That will just reduce the amount of space you create. Continuing with the blocking in. The roof color in the focal area here is a little brighter, a little more vibrant and saturated. And already we're starting to layer the color now, and that creates texture as well. Still very thin, but nevertheless, as soon as you start layering slightly thicker paint, as we're going to do here with this cross-hatching technique. Now that's basically, you know, cross-hatching from drawing, overlapping brush strokes, especially verticals and horizontals. As you can see here, creating different shapes, some overlapping with the others, and that creates a lot of texture. Right, so texture is not simply thick paint, but also the perception of things going on because of the broken color effects you create. A few scar holes in the trees gives you a glimpse of the hill behind, and that creates a sense of space. So keep that in mind, so nothing is too claustrophobic in your painting. Now we're into the second layer as such and creating thicker paint. Thicker, a bit more white paint in it so it gets a little more opaque. And these impasto strokes. Impasto is very important. That's tip number 6 for texture. And impasto just means a thicker paint, slightly more pasty perhaps, but colorful, warm. For the roof, we would generally like to have impasto in areas where there is strong light. So just suggesting a bit of the woodwork, some of the tiles, a bit of light illuminating the edge of the barn. So now this thicker paint goes on and it creates a lot more vibrancy straight away. Adjusting the shadow side for a little more colorful, vibrant and colorful violet colors. Violet and blue shadows will work nicely against all the warm orange and yellow in the painting. So when I add white to make a color more opaque in acrylics, I like to try to add more color into that white so it doesn't end up being too cold, too chalky. Impasto textures on that roof as well, and so on. And we just work through the painting in a sort of methodical fashion. Impasto highlights on the tree. It's starting to come together. We'll also get the textures on the big tree on the left. Varying the brush strokes, small and large, that adds variety and interest to your texture. On the light side of the tree, some dappled light coming through with a warm burnt sienna. On the shadow side, some of that blue violet, creating a nice counterpoint for contrast. Okay, dry brushing, one of my favorite texture strokes, also called scumbling, and that's just dragging thick paint, quite thick with no water in it, and dragging that over the dry underlayer. Paint dries quite quickly with acrylic, so you can get into this technique pretty quickly as you paint. A little bit of that in the background, but you can see how the middle ground now looks like light hitting grass, and then you go back into that with a couple of smaller strokes using the corner of the brush, breaking up shapes, adding little bits of added interest, just suggesting things going on in the shadows and breaking up obvious edges. And your painting naturally just gets more interesting and texture-filled as a result. Moving closer to the foreground now, and you start getting slightly bigger strokes, a bit more paint. The paint also starts getting warmer as you approach the foreground. But always a variety, slightly warm, slightly cool. These little temperature variations also suggest different textures. When one looks at different temperature color strokes, you kind of perceive texture. like you would looking at a grassland in real life. So there's highlights and dark accents, the little strokes of dark burnt sienna amongst the lights, suggesting a bit of ground showing through or some mud perhaps. All of these things create a more interesting and natural looking surface. Right, warmer color, bigger strokes in the foreground, and just to watch the variety of brush strokes going down. Cross-hatching, back and forth, up and down. So you don't need texture mediums, you don't need to add anything to your paint. This is ordinary student acrylics and you can get so much out of it. Touches of green for cool notes amongst the warm notes. Into the foreground shadow that I'm going to bring in here to give us a sort of a step into the painting. So there's little temperature shifts in the shadows as well. Shadows are colorful, but they must remain a shadow, and that's important. So there's our painting already filled with texture, vibrant color, interesting shapes. And from this point on, you can start adding details. I'm going to add in some fence posts. Here's just a little bit of dappled light, a few little accent notes there of reddish burnt sienna. Fence posts go in. Let's put in a figure as well to just help the focal area stand out a bit. And that will be the painting done. And I think you can agree, it's got texture, it's got strong, vibrant color. Just the sort of thing you want with acrylic paints. Simple, but vibrant and colorful. So try out these 7 painting techniques for texture in your acrylic painting, and I'm sure you'll see a difference straight away. So let's sign that off and we'll have a final look at the painting. And I hope you enjoy having a go with your own acrylic painting. Now for the rest, I don't use any mediums right from this point on. Quick sketch, taking a little bit more time with the sketch, a little more detail because it is quite a detailed scene. So I'm getting placement of shapes and proportions. I wouldn't say 100% accurate, of course, but getting a good start to that. And then I will go into it with the painting in a loose fashion. I don't want a tight painting, I don't want details. I want a lot of abstract or kind of abstract shapes. You'll see as I go, I'm sure. It will still be a series of buildings, there'll still be boats, etc. But suggestion of perhaps people walking around, lights and color on the dock side, little things like that, all going to be very much suggested. As I said in the beginning, this is an exercise in simplification and how you simplify a painting. At the sky, with hindsight, the sky is taking up a little too much space. I may even just crop this. If I had to put this into a frame, I'd crop the sky perhaps an inch off the top there. But you work with what you're given, so I'm sticking more or less to the reference and just making a warm sky. I'm not trying to copy that filter that the cameraman has used for the photograph. Now the size of the building, a bit cooler, just a bit of burnt sienna, alizarin and ultramarine blue. I've swapped out a brush here for a smaller long flat. I say smaller, it's just a different brand, and its number 6 is a bit narrower but still long. Sometimes brush manufacturers do vary quite a bit, as I'm sure you've discovered. But working out okay with this painting because of the sort of squeeze of information all in one area. The shadows, I'm hoping, will link up the foreground and connect the foreground to the middle ground and just add a bit more balance to the scene. Windows, very much just starting off anyway with a dark shape, some ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'll add a few lights to that as we go. The roof, pretty much a dark sort of abstract shape. Suggestion of the chimneys, nothing much else. There are some trees in the background. I'll soften those up a little later, just getting more or less their placement. This is still just the blocking in stage of the painting. So frequently my shapes may be a little bigger and I adjust them by cutting in with the background shape. Very important idea to take forward in your painting is sometimes you got to let the background shapes dictate what the foreground shapes are going to look like. These all sort of cool grey buildings. So I'm creating greys from either violet, and sometimes I'll put a little touch of yellow into the violet and then some white to really get a grey, but try to make sure it's either a warm or a cool grey. You're not creating a mud. It has to be a colourful grey, at the very least communicating cool or warm. Just on the subject of grey, of course, you'll never see me creating a grey from black and white paint, mostly because I simply don't have any black paint. So I create blacks, chromatic blacks, with mixing things like burnt sienna and ultramarine, or a deep green with alizarin crimson, and that usually will take care of any black colors you need. Alright, a nice touches of red, bit of that red light coming into the painting, one of the boats, and also a few objects on the dock side, umbrellas, and who knows, it doesn't really matter if I see a color that very often you are thinking about just trying to get the representation correct, get the shapes in the right place, the colors and that sort of thing, but so often we forget about the atmospherics and that sense of three-dimensionality. So we look at the end result and think, well, I don't know what happened there, but it just doesn't have that atmospheric look to it. But something's missing. Exactly what is that? It's hard to pinpoint those things. So you may recognize these common mistakes and think, well, okay, that's what I did. Next time you won't do that and your painting will look so much better. So I'm going to show these tips quite quickly, and then by the end of it you'll have a good idea of what to avoid next time you're painting your landscape painting. Let's have a look. So mistake number one is a lack of value contrast. So that means getting a contrast between the strong values. Remember, values means light and dark, or the degree of lightness or darkness of a shape. So what we want is darkest shapes near the foreground, and as shapes go into the distance they must get lighter. The big mistake is keeping all your values similar. Frequently it's too dark and the distant objects are just as dark as those in the middle. So that's something we have to sort out and make sure our value contrast goes from dark and gradually lighter as you go into the distance. So as we look at this picture, I could have a fence post here and it could be pretty dark. It's right in the foreground, and I could take the posts a little bit further, but as I take them further into the distance, they must get lighter as well. You could pick up a little bit of directional light on your post in the foreground as well, but as it goes into the distance it's pretty much just going to start fading away and getting lighter and cooler. So I'm adding white, a bit of blue. It's also going to get smaller as well and fade away into the distance. The other darks that we see in the picture are the trees. Now trees will be fairly dark because they are vertical and not getting as much sunlight. So these trees right back here, still quite dark, but compared to the overhanging trees, which we got at the top over here, they have to be quite a bit darker. So these over here overhanging right in the foreground are going to be quite dark. So these have got to really start cooling down with more blue and getting softer as well. The tops of the trees will get some reflected light from the sky and could be a little softer as well. Over here, trees, as you can see, are much lighter. Now we can look at them and say they are pretty dark, but look closer, compare them to these in the foreground or in the middle ground here. There's the foreground there, and there's some also in the middle ground here. So these way back here have got to be much lighter. They're just fading back. Okay, the next problem is using too much saturated color in the distance. Now look at these distant hills. There's some grass over there. Now if I took this deep yellow and put that over there, that is a very bright and saturated yellow, and there'd be no real difference to the yellow I put in the foreground. They are basically the same saturation of color, much too bright back there. It could be okay over here, it could work out, and we could have some saturated greens as well and a bit of variety, but all pretty strong colors. Back there we got to get rid of that yellow. As colors recede, and in particular yellow, they'll get cooler, desaturated, and yellow will give way to something more like a yellow ochre. It's better, but it's still quite saturated. Just look at how diffused that color is in the reference. All that atmosphere in between us and that distant shape. So atmosphere, we'll need some white. Let's bring in some cerulean to soften that down even more and cool it. Mix it in. Okay, that is a lot better. That may be just enough, and you work back and forth until you get the right saturation you want. Let's just get rid of that again, and now you can see what we had was too bright. Put that in, and that's more like it. Alright, the next biggest problem, ignoring atmospheric effects. So we want to avoid overlooking the importance of atmospheric effects such as haze and mist, even atmospheric perspective, as it's sometimes called. That's taking into account how colors change over the distance. So we've already suggested some of that already, but we can see some mist at the foot of some of those hills. So let's get a bit of white, blue and alizarin, and we can start putting some of that in at the foot of the distant mountain and creating that misty effect. Even some right back. Just glimpse behind there. Let's just take that up a little bit. And even the trees, we can mix in some blue, bit of yellow ochre, and we can get some misty looking trees. Right, and one of the important things, of course, is having a look at how that mist is influencing, or the haze, or whatever it may be, is influencing the edges of shapes, much softer edges. Alright, so that's how atmosphere and the haze and all the mist or whatever it may be, those atmospheric conditions, is going to influence. Alright, the next mistake is making distant objects too detailed. Okay, so that is so often the case. Let's say we've got some trees way back here, and now we go and put in tree trunks, and they come forward. You can't see that detail in real life. Those details don't exist. Don't put them in. Okay, we don't need to see that.